Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Welcome to the Daybreak Asia podcast. I'm Doug Krisner. In the States, federal prosecutors have opened a criminal investigation into Fed Chair Jay Powell. Now, this is over the Fed's renovation of its Washington, D.C. headquarters. The New York Times reported a key issue is whether Powell lied to Congress about the scope of this project. Well, the report prompted Powell to issue a video statement. He said the Fed had been served grand jury subpoenas from the Department of Justice, while at the same time, Powell hit back at the probe. Here's Powell.
The threat of criminal charges is a consequence of the Federal Reserve setting interest rates based on our best assessment of what will serve the public, rather than following the preferences of the president.
That was Fed Chair Jay Powell. Right now, we're seeing dollar weakness with the Bloomberg Dollar Spot Index down about 0.2%. At the same time, we've got a rally underway in precious metals. Spot gold is up 1.5%, and silver is up 4.4% at the moment. Japan is closed for a public holiday, and that means the first time we're going to get any reaction to the Powell story reflected in U.S. Treasuries will be in the London session. For a closer look now at markets across the Asia Pacific as we begin a new trading week, I'm joined by Bloomberg's Lianting Tu. She is managing editor for Asian Equities. Lianting joining from our studios in Singapore. Thanks for making time. Can we talk about the reaction that you're seeing to the Powell story being reflected in markets across the Asia Pacific?
Yeah, people are debating, the outlook for the Fed independence. That's basically the biggest sort of focal point for investors. Right now, as you said, the dollar is slightly weaker, and the U.S. futures also dipped. In fact, the futures reaction is actually a little bit bigger than in the dollar, and the precious metals are up for safe haven bid. So overall, the question is, this is definitely not a good look for the Fed, for the U.S. government, or for the U.S. market as a whole. Although the immediate reaction is not drastic, people are really questioning the kind of longer term structural issue because this really challenges Fed's independence. So the takeaway here is, first of all, look at the noise level, right? If in the end we're looking at court appearances, stuff like that, and that will really have more of a repercussion for investors, causing a little bit more jitterness among global investors. And the longer term trend is really the de-dollarization, and that has been happening even without the subpoena news. But, again, with the noise level heightening, I think there's going to be a bit of a speed up for U.S. or global investors to shift some of their U.S. assets and relocate outside of the U.S.
Lianting, let's talk a little bit about what's happening right now in terms of equity market action in the Asia Pacific. Right now, it's kind of a mixed picture, and I can understand that given the volatility that you just highlighted. But let's not lose sight of the fact that there has been a lot of positivity lately in equities in the Asia Pacific, especially where tech stocks are concerned. Now, South Korea, as you and I both know, has been a bright spot, particularly for the chip makers. This is all about the build-out of artificial intelligence, right?
Yeah, indeed. If you look at a tech gauge for Asia Tech versus NASDAQ 100, we're looking at a huge outperformance. Last I checked was year to date, the Asia gauge was up more than 6%, and that is compared to NASDAQ's gain of about 2%. We really haven't seen that kind of outperformance at the start of the year for a very long time. And as you said, Korea is an outstanding winner. That's because the valuation is indeed cheap, right? Even after a 70-something percent gain last year, the valuation, forward PE valuation is still at about 10 times. 10 times for the Kospi. That compares with 25 times for the NASDAQ 100. And if you look at earnings potential, Korea Kospi estimated earnings growth for the next 12 months is at more than 70%, and that compares to about 18% for the MAX 7. So you can see the fundamental driver of earnings plus valuation are really providing a tailwind for Korean stock.
So the IPO markets have been very busy as well, not only on the Chinese mainland, but in Hong Kong. And a number of these IPOs are tied to tech, particularly, again, this area of semiconductors. What are we seeing at the moment?
Yeah, so today we're seeing OmniVision, that's a chip designer, raising about $660 million. It's up not by a lot, but last I checked was up more than 3%. That's a continuation. We saw last week 2 AI large language model developers debuting, and both debuted or performed very well, I should say, and that was Minimax and Zhipu. And that they actually came to the public market before OpenAI, which was also planning for an IPO. Overall, I think there is always a balance between, whether these IPOs would digress or divert money away from the existing shares. But in this case, I think there is still fresh money going into these deals, and these deals performing well is underpinning a further rally in the AI sector in China.
So later in the week, as you know, we'll be hearing from TSMC. The company will report full quarterly earnings and also provide a forecast on capital spending for 2026. Last week, we had the monthly revenue figures for TSMC. They came in above estimates. So I'm thinking that the market feels pretty good about where TSMC is with respect to earnings.
Yeah, for TSMC, we saw a slew of Wall Street analyst upgrades leading up to the earnings that will come out on Thursday this week. I believe we saw Morgan Stanley, we saw Goldman Sachs, and I think overall they're talking about how this tech chip maker, I should say, is really very well positioned in the global semiconductor supply chain, just because the valuation for the company is actually not expensive, and in any kind of environment, it still has to provide chips for all sorts of sort of demand, and the positioning is unbeatable according to those analysts.
Are there any pieces of economic news in the coming week that have the potential to move markets either in China, Japan, or even Australia?
I think overall it would be the kind of rate decisions, right? Australia, Japan, and China. I think there's a bit of a divergence in global central bank rate decisions. We're looking at Japan potentially, hiking again, and Australia potentially cutting again. Of course, the U.S. Fed may cut, but the schedule has been moved back a little bit because of the jobs data that came out on Friday, which were a bit solid. So I think the kind of implication from the divergent central bank rate decisions will really play out in investors' mind. And for China, there is also the MPC that's coming up in March, and the kind of reinforcement on the self-reliance agenda, the development of the chip sector, the competition again is the US AI, and I think that can continue to provide a tailwind for the AI and chip sector in China.
Lianting, we'll leave it there. Thank you so very much. Bloomberg's Lianting Tu. She is managing editor for Asia Equities, joining from our studios in Singapore here on the Daybreak Asia podcast. Welcome back to the Daybreak Asia podcast. I'm Doug Krisner. Japan is closed for a public holiday today. Nonetheless, investors are squarely focused on reports that Prime Minister Takaichi will be calling for a snap election. The view is Takaichi will try to leverage her popularity to strengthen her coalition's grip on power. And that's where we began the conversation with Tobias Harris. He is the founder and principal at Japan Foresight. Harris spoke to Bloomberg TV host Paul Allen and Avril Hong.
Thanks for joining us. I'm wondering where you would place the odds of Prime Minister Takaichi calling a snap election. And she's performing very well in the polls at the moment. Is this a strategically useful time to strike? And what are her chances of getting a fresh mandate if she does?
Well, I think this came on very quickly. As recently as really last Thursday, she was even saying that she was focused on getting the budget passed, which really is job number one as far as the new diet session is concerned. And there were too many policy issues, there were too many things going on, and certainly the consensus seemed to be that we wouldn't see an election before April. April would really be the earliest. And so the story that broke late Friday in Yomiuri was, I think, caught everyone by surprise. And frankly, I think we should note there's been a lot of pushback, and not just from opposition parties. We've had several reports over the weekend that Asotaro, who of course course, is one of Takaichi's biggest backers, does not think that an election is suitable at this time. We've had now, of course, the leader of the Democratic Party for the People, Tamaki Yuichiro, whose support is going to be essential for passing the budget. And really, the deal that the LDP made with Tamaki was really the key to ensuring the budget was going to pass. He has said that if there's an election, that he will not necessarily follow his promise of supporting the budget. So there's a lot of moving parts here. I don't think we can say it's 100% guaranteed at this point that there's going to be an election.
Yeah, how much public appetite is there for a snap election coming so early? And even if Sanae Takaichi was successful and won a stronger mandate in the lower house, she still doesn't have a majority in the upper house. So there are going to be challenges anyway in getting her agenda through.
I think that really is one of the questions really, that has surrounded this entire debate about whether she was going to have a snap election, where, of course, yes, you look at her overall headline approval numbers, they're great, they're strong, but of course, there have been lots of questions about what her coattails would actually be like, given that the LDP can no longer rely on the support of its longtime coalition partner, Komeito, given some questions about the influence of the rise of right-wing parties, particularly Sansaito, on some of the right-wing vote that the LDP needs to bring back. So there were questions, I think, about how the LDP might perform, but I think there was also the question of why an election, why now? And I think if you look at opinion polls, the public is not convinced that an election is suitable at this time. And given that she was so adamant recently that no, there's too much to do, there's too much to focus on, I'm not thinking about an election now, for her to then turn around, I think she's going to face a lot of accusations of opportunism as this debate swirls in the next few days.
In terms of priorities for Takaichi, given the public's concerns about the cost of living, how would you say they are assessing the progress she's made on that front? That's really the other debate I think that's happening, particularly within the LDP, where you've had a number of voices say, we can't move too quickly because ultimately we haven't really made an impact on the issues that people are most concerned about. We're still vulnerable on that front. The people are still feeling the impact of inflation. You're still seeing food prices rise, seeing another rise in rice prices recently. All of that I think is still going to be weighing on people's minds. And if you add on top of that a feeling that this is just an opportunistic move, she's trying to grab more seats while the going looks good. And also the fact that she then is putting her own budget at risk because, frankly, a February 8th election, a February 15th election, you really only have, they need to get a budget done before the fiscal year starts on April 1st. She's really going to be cutting that close. And it really is going to raise a lot of questions. And I think the opposition is going to be very quick to ask those questions. What is more important to her? Doing things that help the public, getting a budget done that supposedly has all sorts of things that's going to help the public deal with cost of living increases, or is she worried about her political future first? And I think those questions are going to dog, if she goes forward with this, those questions are going to be front and center. How is the spat with Beijing affecting her political future?
I think in the near term, I don't think it's hurt. I think the public, certainly, if anything, it's probably helped her numbers stay as strong as they have for as long as they have. I think that, of course, the public, does not view Japan as in the wrong here. Polls have consistently shown that majorities think that there was nothing wrong with what Takaichi said. They're, of course, concerned about what Beijing's doing. Interestingly, and I think this is maybe a question for how people might vote, there's a real age gap between how the public is responding to this dispute with China, where older voters are much more divided over, first, whether they support what Takaichi said or whether Japan should be more conciliatory. Younger voters, who the LDP is really desperate to bring out in its favor and draw away from Sansaito, to draw away from the Democratic Party for the People, are much more overwhelmingly supportive of Takaichi. So it's interesting to see, one of her theories, taking office was, can I bring, Takaichi, is she the person to bring some of these voters who've been attracted to Sansaito back to the LDP? And maybe this is a sign that actually that could work. But will she lose some of the older voters the LDP has relied on in recent elections? I think that's a question that the party's going to face going forward.
Well, Tobias, your specialty is political risk and advice. What advice would you be giving to Sanae Takaichi if you were asked about how to handle these export controls from China and whether retaliation is even advisable?
I think, Japan doesn't necessarily have the same tools or the same desire to retaliate in the ways, that China has been using its various levers to pressure Japan. I mean, I think ultimately, Japan is going to have to do the kinds of things that it's been doing really for a long time, which is diversifying away from China. And that's not, unfortunately, it's not a short-term response to China. That's not really something that they can fix overnight. But we already saw that after the incidents, in 2010 and in 2012, Japanese companies started diversifying. Japan as a whole started diversifying away from rare earths and finding other sources for rare earths and other critical minerals. That process is going to pick up. And just in general, I think if you look at surveys over the last several months, I mean, corporate Japan, there's not a whole lot of appetite for new investment in China. I think, of course, there's not a lot of appetite for decoupling either. But when it comes to deepening Japan's engagement, I mean, that appetite, I think, is not there. And I think there's, a real sensitivity to the political risks in China and trying to find other markets, trying to find other places to go. And of course, that also explains perhaps the interest that we've seen in deepening ties with the United States, even though that comes with its own risks as well.
Yeah, I was going to ask, to what extent do you think there's appetite from the Trump administration in terms of support for Takaichi, given how there are a number of fronts, foreign fronts, that the U.S. administration, including Venezuela, is having to look at even closer now?
Well, I think that phone call between Trump and Takaichi last year, certainly was a sign that this was not going to be an issue that the U.S. is going to be invested in at the highest levels. I mean, we've seen messages of support, from the embassy in Tokyo and from other parts of the administration, but certainly at the presidential level, at the very highest level, they're not investing political capital and showing a lot of support for Takaichi. And of course, you have the prospect of the president going to China in April. That, of course, as far as Asia is concerned, that maybe is, absolutely front of mind more than any other issue. But yes, in the immediate term, there are things that are just taking much more attention. And Japan, in a lot of ways, maybe is on its own. I mean, and again, that can be overstated. We're going to see, I think, this week with the defense minister, Koizumi Shinjiro, he'll be in Washington. Finance minister Katayama will be in Washington talking about supply chain resilience. So there's cooperation there. There's going to be messages of support. But when it comes to actually, really throwing U.S. weight behind Japan in this dispute and trying to get China to back down, that's not something I expect that we'll see from the United States.
That was Tobias Harris, founder and principal at Japan Foresight, speaking with Bloomberg TV host Paul Allen and Avril Hong here on the Daybreak Asia podcast. Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Bloomberg Daybreak Asia Edition podcast. Each weekday, we look at the stories shaping markets, finance, and geopolitics in the Asia Pacific. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, the Bloomberg Podcast YouTube channel, or anywhere else you listen. Join us again tomorrow for insight on the market moves from Hong Kong to Singapore and Australia. I'm Doug Krisner, and this is Bloomberg.